disappointment that I have expressed my degree of regret on that to colleagues, but it is what it is. Look, I now want to can I formally, Rebecca, open the meeting?
Yes, I believe that we are broadcasting now, Robin.
Right, okay, so I'm just going to formally declare the meeting of the Hearings and Engagement Committee open, and you'll see that I'm using my iPhone just to go to the run sheet.
Me too.
And I just first of all, as I understand it, I first of all note the apologies. And Councillor Thompson, Councillor O'Leary, Councillor McPherson, Councillor Naidoo-Rove, Councillor Hamilton and Councillor Bunting, I'll move that those apologies be sustained. Second by Deputy Chair Wilson. All those in favour? Those to the contrary? Are there any other apologies, by the way, that people are aware of? Sorry. If there are none, we now move on to the confirmation of the agenda, and I will move to confirm the agenda. Moved by myself, second to Councillor Wilson. Thank you. All those in favour, those to the contrary, carried. I just now advise item 3, are there any declarations of interest? There are none. We now move on to item 4, which is page 5, the confirmation of Hearings and Engagement Committee minutes, the 17th of March. Now that should be more or less moved by people who were present. But I think we're going to have to, I will have to move, excuse me, I will have to move. I do note, of course, that the people present were myself, Councillor Leary and Councillor Thompson. In that situation, I'm wondering, Councillor Wilson, if you would agree to just confirm
Happily.
those. Okay.
I've read them.
All right. I will move confirmation. Seconded Councillor Wilson. All those in favour, those to the contrary, that is carried. Now, we now move to the item 5, parking restrictions. Forgive me. And I'm going to invite Robin, I assume, Robin Denton to come and address those. Now, given that we do have a public gallery, Robin, I'm wondering if you could just give a general summary of the background. And normally we would take this report as read, but in the circumstances that we're in, it probably would be helpful if you could just give a bit of a précis of the staff recommendations to hearings.
Can I ask a question, Martin, please?
Yes, indeed. Yes.
With questions, do you want us to do the raise your hand button or do it this way?
No, because Rebecca Watson is running the controls of this virtual reality meeting. And as you all know, my IT skills are not particularly brilliant. So I want you just to raise your hand physically. Rebecca, however, if I miss someone, is going to flash a reminder to me for all of us to see on the screen that someone's waiting. Okay. So,
thanks, Martin.
Right. Okay, Robin.
So good morning, councillors. So parking restrictions report basically deals with a number of restrictions. They can include no stopping, time limit restrictions, bus stops, loading zones, those sorts of things. The report consists of 3 key areas. One is ongoing work that we're doing, which is just tidying up our restrictions. We've been moving them through from a paper form through to GIS. And as part of that, we're just picking up little bits and pieces that are not quite right. So it may be that the parking restriction has been extended by a metre or two. So just making sure we get them all right. We have a number of changes out on the network where we're responding to requests for service, or they are associated with physical works that we are doing mainly through our low cost, low risk program. And then finally, for this meeting, we have a couple of changes proposed in Rafferty Street, which relate to a development that's happening in there, and a requirement to move a few, it's actually providing a few extra car parks in that location. So they're the sort of key components that we've got for today's meeting.
I have a question, Martin.
Thank you,
when you're
Robin.
ready.
Just one. I know, Rebecca, we did have someone who wanted to make a resident who wanted to make a submission. I take it that they've withdrawn that. Was there any written correspondence from that person that we needed to circulate?
No, there's nothing.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I think Councillor Wilson, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. Robin, could you just guide me through what the current approach is to the appropriate distance of no stopping or parking at an intersection? Is there a global benchmark? Is there a standard?
Yeah, so there's guidance, first of all, in the road code, which relates back to the road user rule. And it's, off the top of my head, it's something like 6 to 8 metres back from the intersection. And then if it's a T intersection, there's you're not meant to park in the in the head of the T. But it often depends on the actual intersection itself, how wide it is, how easy it is to actually swing into that intersection. And in a lot of cases, it depends on the parking demand in that street too, as to whether people are literally pushing it to the limit and parking, making use of all the space available.
So Robin, so are there any of, because I notice Anson Avenue, you're suggesting that we reduce the space from 18 metres to 11. Yes. And I'd like to talk to you about that separately. But my first question is there any of those that are in the recommendation today that are not compliant with best practice, being between the 6 and the 8 metres?
No.
Because from what I can... Sorry.
Yeah. So the change to Anson is very much associated with the fact that we're putting a raised safety platform at that intersection. So that's going to help manage the speeds into that intersection. And as part of the design work, it's been identified that there's the ability to fit one more car park in there. Most cases we are putting in no stopping restrictions that basically support what the general rule is for that area. And it's the same with a lot of the no stopping that we put across driveways, etc. They are generally just supporting what the requirements are anyway. But
so which ones are not? Which ones of the recommendations today are not compliant with the best practice 6 to 8 metres?
None that I can think of off the top of my head. Most of them are putting in restrictions that reflect that, at least, if not more.
Right. Okay, so I think what you've told me is, and the ones that you're putting in, they're all not less than the 6 to 8 metres. And I think I've heard you say to me that in Anson, we're reducing the non-stopping and making one more car park because of a raised alteration,
Yes.
and it's a speed related, but surely vehicles that are parked, does that not help reduce the speed, or have I misunderstood that from other?
No, you're spot on. So what this is doing is actually allowing people to park a bit closer to the intersection. And you're right, it helps manage those speeds. So if you look at page 25 of the report,
Yep. Yep.
that's got a picture there of the raised safety platform that's being proposed to be installed.
Right.
And shows where in blue, just opposite the words Anson Ave, that's the additional car park that's being put back in, and therefore the reduction in no stopping that's being proposed.
Thank you.
Right. Is that all, Councillor Wilson?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I now go to Councillor Pascoe.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Robin, for the report. I've got 3 questions. First question is the increased parking restrictions around Charles Crescent, Portal, Mitchin, Verco, Varden Road, etc., is that an attempt to deal with the parking issues of the staff working at the Ministry of Education and Inland Revenue and so forth?
Did you have a page that showed that? Did you have a page number for those just to help me out? Sorry, Councillor. I'm just trying to flick through and find them.
Yeah, they're all over the place. There's
Okay.
hang
Okay.
on.
No,
I read them on the list.
okay.
There's quite a number there, and a lot of them I know are around corners and so forth. But I also know that we've had some issues with parking in those back streets behind where the Inland Revenue is, and that's come about, I think, in recent times since the IRD moved out to Te Rapa. And I just picked out a number of streets there that I'm aware of that are in that particular area. And some of them don't follow a line, but they seem to suggest that there's a lot more activity in that area than there would have ordinarily been, I would have thought, in one report. And I just asked if whether or not that's an attempt to try and address that parking issue.
Okay, thank you. So I've just flicked through to page 75 and 76 of the report. So as I outlined earlier, a lot of the restrictions here are tidying up. The new restrictions are listed on page 75 and 76. Everything else apart from that is tidy up. So I believe, looking through that list, Te Rapa is the only one that's in around that general area. So the rest of them are just tidy ups of the existing restrictions, Councillor Pascoe.
Is that still a problem in those streets behind, Charles Crescent, those streets in behind where the Inland Revenue is, the residential area? Is that still a problem in terms of residents there having difficulty getting in and out of their driveways because of cars being parked there?
We still have 1 or 2 residents that come and talk to us every 2 to 3 months. But in general, it seems to have settled.
Okay.
We are aware that there's some more development proposed in on that site, and so there's work being done around trying to ensure that the correct parking provision is put in place as part of that development.
Okay, thank you. The second question is, you may recall, and I've forgotten the gentleman's name, but there's a resident living across the road from Chartwell Square in Crombie's Road, and there is parking outside his property, and he came to me earlier this year, and I think I did refer it through to you or to your people, and that was around whether or not we should be changing the no stopping from one side of Crombie's Road across to the other. That was one of his suggestions. but he was still having problems with cars parking over his driveway, even though the car parks are very clearly, the roads painted with the areas where that car park could be. Have we done anything further on that, or is it still an ongoing issue, or has it settled down?
It's not ringing any bells for me, I'm afraid. I'm going to have
Okay.
to follow up for that one and come back to you. So apologies for that.
That's no. I would have expected him to have been on to me in respect to it if it was still an unsolved problem. But that's good. And the third question is around the link, and that's on page 28. That's a relatively new street that's been created and runs into Tahuia Drive. And of course, on that corner, there's an intensive development that's been undertaken. What's the reason for putting those yellow lines there? Is it to prevent parking on the street outside?
Yes.
By the residents who are likely to be groups rather than families?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of activity there, obviously, with the construction work going on, and so we received a request to put that no stopping in place because people were already seeing the difference that it made to their visibility to get around there from the construction type vehicles. So we've got on and responded to that, and yeah.
Do you think you're covering enough area? I'm not sure. It doesn't run back to Discovery Drive, does it? There will be some parking between Discovery and where the lines start when you pull into the link.
Yeah, it's always hard to know exactly what the demand's going to be. So, I mean, we've always got the ability, through these meetings to put more in if we need to. So we try to err on the side of not putting in miles of restrictions to see if we can get it to work, and we can always come back and add more, sort of thing.
Yeah, I understand that. I think the development hasn't completely sold yet. So the impact of, and I'm thinking here of also refuse pickups and so forth after July, that particular area I suspect is going to turn itself into into quite a traffic jam, and I think those lines are well heeled in that place. But it may be just worth keeping a watching brief as it develops. So thank you, Chair. Thanks, Robin.
Thank you.
Thank you. And just before I move to Councillor Taylor, I think picking up from your questions to Robin and our General Manager, President Belisa, right, is when we are looking at the issue of higher density residential and infill and some of the unintended consequences, my trend would be, I think, Robin, you're going to be very useful, you and your team, to give us some overview of some of the trends that you have observed around parking issues along streets with this high density. And also then the other related thing is in terms of the enforcement component with our parking and stationary traffic team who have come out and, obviously will be interested to kind of see some trend line of the call-outs. And for example, I'm thinking of the IRD building shared quarters, which left the CBD, went to the Te Rapa Strait area, but there was some flow on in terms of problems with the surrounding streets. So I think that's kind of sort of some data when we look at some of the unintended consequences of how we are approaching infill that will be really useful. Councillor Taylor?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Robin, Te Rapa Road on page 26, which I think I understand is one of the new restrictions.
Yes.
Can you just very quickly just explain that to me? How many parks are we losing there? I'm just struggling to see from the picture.
Yeah, so that was basically a request from that business. And I'm just going to flick back to that picture. Sorry.
No worries.
It's the trouble with these big reports. It takes a bit to get back to the picture.
It does.
Here we go. So a lot of that length is actually is picking up driveways. So there's a bit of that in there. So at the top end, there's obviously a driveway. You can see the arrow coming into the number 529, and then there's the driveway into 497. So there's in the order of probably 2 to 3 car parks in that top section. And then in the second section, possibly 1 car park there. But we have done consultation with those businesses. I think they actually wanted more. As I've said, we try to sort of minimise the amount that we lose on the basis that we can always come in and put some more in if we need to.
Okay. I mean, I'm not a big fan of losing car parks and busy sought-after areas unless it's absolutely necessary. So was this a safety concern? Could you tell me what their request was? Why were they requesting it?
Basically, they're having difficulty getting in and out of their driveways safely. So it's that visibility and merging into the traffic, which is a 60 speed restriction in this area.
Okay, so is that number 487 the business?
497.
Sorry, 497. Is that?
Yes.
So they were having trouble with that driveway at the top of the picture, is it?
Yes. Yes. Coming in and out of that. Yes.
Because of visibility.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. The other one was, I think, one that is an existing change, which maybe we're just gazetting, and that's Taylor Terrace on page 42.
You presumably have no interest in Taylor Terrace, Councillor Taylor. Obviously, no declaration of interest, no financial interest. Thank you.
None whatsoever, Chair. Thank you for checking. I'll just find it myself. Page 42. I just very quickly keen just to know the background behind Taylor Terrace there, because it's a is it a very narrow street, or because it's a big swathe there that we've
and this is just capturing what's already out on site.
Yeah, but why is it out on site is what I want to know.
The history behind it. I wouldn't know the exact details of it, but I think it probably is to do with the width and catering for people getting in and out of driveways, that sort of thing. Yes, a lot of these are very historic. Sorry.
Yeah. That's fine, and I appreciate the fact that it's not a new decision; it's one that's been made. I was just curious as to the reasons for it, because it's taken out a whole very long sort of piece of street there. So there must have been a really good reason.
Before my time, probably. Okay.
All right. I'm just very conscious, particularly from when I was driving around trying to put up election signs, about how hard it was to find a park in some of these places. And I'd love to see it change before the next election campaign if I could. But no, thanks, Robin. That's great.
Yeah, we're always open to residents coming back to us and saying, that they want no stopping removed, and having a look at that. And often we get that when properties have changed ownership, that people, and we're happy to have a look at that and see if there's opportunities for getting more parking on street.
Okay, and sorry, with that Tarapa one, you were completely satisfied that there was a genuine safety issue there. So you actually do your own appraisal. You don't just react and say, "Oh, we better do it." No.
Yep. We for all of these we go out and we generally try and do a drive in and out to actually have a look at that. Okay. And we do a measure up. So there is, through the district plan, guidance around the visibility. And that depends on the type of road that you are entering to. So with Tarapa, the visibility requirements are greater because of the speed, but also because it's an arterial. So very different to your local residential streets where there's not. So basically in a residential street, a parked vehicle is considered just a temporary obstruction, so it doesn't really come into consideration quite so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you, and I'm aware, obviously, for people watching this, that we have a hard copy report, and Rob and I compliment you also on the aerial photos, which are really, pictures 1,000 words, as they say. That's exceptionally useful to assist us. Are there any other further questions? Sorry, Councillor Forsyth.
Thanks, Martin. Robert, thanks for a great report. Totally, agree with the chair. The photos speak a million words.
I've got a young man who does all that work for me, and he does a brilliant job. So I won't take the credit for that.
Please pass on our compliments. Thank you, Councillor Forsyth.
Thank you. So, Robin, can you just refresh my memory? It's been a wee while since I've been on this hearing committee and going through this process again. Can you just remind me what the gazetting process is all about, and how, because I noticed that there are some gazetted entries and also just some added extra parking or no stopping.
Yeah, it's almost a terminology difference and not an actual legal difference. So all of these are set under the traffic bylaw, and gazette is it's almost the old-fashioned term that we used to actually publish gazettes around it. So it's basically imposing the restriction and legalising it through this process, and capturing it nowadays into our GIS system. It used to be that, and we had folders of them for each restriction. We had a page that was called a gazette, and that was the folders that we had, and we're moving away from folders of paper. So it's more of a term than anything.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I just needed that clarification. And just as a part of that as well, we're doing some historic gazetting still. Is that right?
We are basically trying to do a tidy up, as we've been moving all of our paper versions into a GIS system, which ultimately we're going to have available for the public, but also makes life easier for our parking wardens and our road markers and all of those sorts of folks when they're out and about doing their work, obviously being able to look it up live rather than having to ring out and get the guys to flick literally through a folder of paper. So as they move from trying to put that paper version into the electronic, we're doing checks primarily through the Google Maps City View type process to actually check that what the words are versus what's actually now on site are the same. And often we've found over time that, no stopping restrictions, they might, if they've marked an extra 1 metre line and bits and pieces. So it's just tidying up that, picking up where in some cases they haven't actually gone through this legal process, and making sure that everything's really tidy.
Good, thank you. Just a couple more questions, if I may. Can you tell me what's the threshold for our action on introducing, let's say, more parking restrictions or adding more no stopping lines?
So a lot of our restrictions are as a result of requests for service that we get from the community.
Yeah, but what's the threshold? Is it one? So one person can ring up and say, hey, listen, I need something done, and then we go along and act on it? Or does it have to be a minimum of 3? Or how does that work?
It's very much a case-by-case basis. If it's something that we have a look at and go, yes, I can clearly see that there's a safety problem, then we get on and start the consultation process. If it's one where it's perhaps as a result of, it might be because there's some building going on or bits and pieces like that, we will try and see if we can facilitate the issue by perhaps talking to the contractor. Often we get our parking team to have a regular drive-by to see if it's actually something that's a reoccurring issue, or was it a once-off. So we work through those sorts of things. We often find that just marking the white hold bar solves a lot of problems, and we don't need to go through a legal process to do that. So we will try and go down those avenues before we actually start marking no stopping on the road and legalising that.
Okay, thank you. So it's very much a case by case, and you go
Yes.
out and you're on the ground and you're checking it.
Yeah.
When you say consultation, what does that look like? So just
so-
my memory.
If we're looking to make a change, then we do some consultation with the immediately affected parties. So that generally is the property where the restriction is going to be put, and one or two either side, and then across the road the same
That's
sort of
right.
extent. So again, it's a case by case. Obviously, if in some locations the impact is greater than others, and we try and think about who would be affected by that change.
Cool, thank you. I think there's just one more. Are there any interventions here that have been council generated and not community generated?
There are a couple, and they relate to physical works changes. So Anson Ave that we talked about earlier was as a result of us doing some physical works and minor safety improvements.
Okay.
And so we do often, when we're doing a minor safety improvement, we might move curb lines or bits and pieces, and that's when we have a look and make adjustments. So we do get a few that we generate, yes.
And lastly, it's a slightly bigger scope question, and you did mention earlier on when Rob was asking about the street behind the IRD, and I remember being actually around at that time. It was a concern when workers were parking on the neighbourhood streets. So you did mention that there's looking to be another development close to that site, so potentially more workers and cars, etc. It's probably heading into the district plan area, but if we're encouraging building and places of work, are we at the same time making sure that we've got bus stops close by, or are we drawing those closer to these areas? And I know moving bus stops is not an easy thing to do. We're not nimble about it, but yeah, is there a bigger picture? And I know we have to operate within rules, but if we're going to be providing more car parks and we've got more building with more cars, places of employment, etc., then we've got to be, parts of the organisation are got to be working together.
So we certainly get involved with any new developments that come through and work with the planning team. And part of that at the early stages is where they do their traffic impact assessment, and depending on where the development is, it's looking at what are the requirements for their parking provision. Because a lot of our developments, there's a requirement to provide parking, and often they are requesting dispensation for not providing the full number. So we work through those at that stage. We often have developments that are proposing that require changes on street, and so there's a desire to try and work through those through this committee before we grant the resource consent, so that there is actually some good discussion and the ability for councillors, this committee, to perhaps say no, or to ask for a slightly different solution to be developed up.
Okay.
And then on a case-by-case basis, we are looking at what else can be done. And in cases like the IRD building, there's not a lot that we can do about the bus stops in the general area and that sort of thing. They are reasonably close by. But we do try and work with the organisations, and we've just recently employed a workplace travel advisor to try and work with these, particularly the large employers, to think about how people are going to get to work. And so that's looking at provision of bike parks, what they're doing to encourage carpooling, what incentives they're providing perhaps for busing, and it may be that they subsidise some of that travel, those sorts of things. So as I said, we've recently employed someone into that role, so that's going to be something that we're going to be more actively involved with moving forward.
Fantastic, thanks, Robin. Great.
Thank you. Councillor Van Oosten.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Robin, for your comments, particularly those last ones. I have a question, but also just a quick comment on that. I think in our changed times, that's something that could be really commended. Council looking for to bring consultants in that have a wider view of how building occupants can be getting to work, and the responsibility of those larger employers to offer some solutions for their workers. Some of that might in fact even be working from home these days. And hopefully therefore alleviate some of that problem that sits around what Councillor Pascoe raised. I just want us to go back to that consultation question that Margaret raised, and have an understanding about the forms of consultation that you take. Is it that you are
sorry, I'll just ask, apologies, I'm just going to ask Councillor Wilson as Deputy Chair just to quickly assume the chair for 10 seconds. Thank you, Councillor Wilson.
Yep, go ahead.
Sorry, Councillor Banny.
Thank you. I'll just go back to that. Just the forms of consultation that you are taking with people. Is it face-to-face interviews? Is it over the telephone, via a letter in the letterbox? Can you just give me a better understanding of how that might work? And is there a stepped-out plan on how to do that well?
Yeah, so we've got a fairly standardised process that we utilise, and as I said, a lot of this is generated by requests for service. So we have generally gone out and met with the person on site to understand what the issue is. Often it will be at least a phone call with the person who's raised the issue. And then what we do is, in preparation for the committee report, it's about 8 weeks out, we start our consultation process. So we do a bulk lot of consultation leading up to each committee report, so that basically the process is not too long-winded, that people are getting that early consultation and then actually see the results within a reasonable amount of time. But it's still about 8 weeks by the time we do all the pretty pictures and generate the report and work through the report process. So we've generally spoken on site with the person. If not on site, then we've spoken to them on the phone. Then we do a letter drop, and as part of that letter drop, those pretty pictures are included within that, basically outlining what it is that we're looking at doing and why. And then we invite people to come back to us and let us know whether they're happy or not. So we do get quite a good feedback on that. And in a lot of cases, it's just, yes, really happy, really glad something's happening, that sort of thing. If we've got people who go, no, or I'd rather this or rather that, then we often go back out and try and negotiate something that's going to work. So it may be that this person wanted this amount, but somebody else goes, no, actually, I think that's too much. Or we try and actually broker some sort of solution and work through that before we put a final recommendation through to council. If we can't get an agreement, we make an assessment as to whether we believe it's a major safety issue or just a nuisance. If we can't get people to agree and we think it's a nuisance, then we basically say, well, we're going to leave it at this point. If it's a safety issue, then we will bring it to council, and we haven't had any just lately, but we'll write a bit of a report that actually outlines what the issues were, what we've tried to put in, and what we think is a reasonable compromise recommendation, and put that through to councillors for them to consider. But we only do that when there hasn't been agreement and we believe that there's a safety issue involved. Everyone is made aware of the committee meeting and are given the opportunity to come to this committee and either speak to them or just to observe the process. So we do try to be reasonably involving of the community and make sure that everyone's basically comfortable with what we're doing.
Oh, that sounds really fair and pragmatic. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. And those questions from members today have been very useful, because obviously being aware of people who may be sitting in what I call the virtual reality public gallery, but for the rest of us, doesn't matter whether we've just arrived on council recently or been around for 1 or 2 years. It is a really good reminder just to focus us back on the process and what is our legal requirement in terms of the acts of parliament and bylaws, but also the process we engage. And obviously, I think the very relevant things around the way in which we engage in dialogue with neighbours and immediate communities. Committee advisor Rebecca Watson, I think we're now in a position to go off into debate. I think, is that the end of questions? So what I'm now proposing is we do have the staff recommendation, which is that the Hearings and Engagement Committee approves the changes to the parking restrictions controls as set out below, and there's obviously a series of streets. Do I have a mover for that particular recommendation?
I'll move all of them, and I guess if anybody wants to highlight one they would fit a pull out, we could do it that way. So move.
Sure. So do I have a second? Do I have a second of Councillor Wilson's motion? Seconded Councillor Deputy Mayor Taylor.
What page is that?
Yeah, sorry, Councillor Forsyth.
What page is this, sorry?
It's page, good question, it's page 12, on page 12 of 84.
Thank you.
Okay, now just before we move ahead, thank you very much. Our committee advisor Rebecca has actually now put this up on the screen for us and for people who are watching this. So there's a series of streets there as per what's up on the screen. Before we proceed to debate, is there any member of the committee who wants to take any of these streets out of this staff recommendation? If there are none, I will now move back to the move of the motion, Councillor Wilson.
Mr. Chair, I have nothing to say. The report is self-explanatory.
Right. Okay. Seconder, do you have anything to say, Deputy Mayor Taylor?
No, I'm very happy to proceed. Thank you.
Any other contributions? If there are none, sorry, because obviously now we're just looking at the recommendations. Okay. I will put the motion that the Hearings and Engagements Committee approves the changes to the parking restrictions controls as set out below, as per from page 12 onwards of our agenda, seconded by Deputy Mayor Taylor. All those in favour will raise your hands, please. We're now back on the multi-screen. Right, and I just have to go through this. Councillor Wilson, Councillor Van Oosten, Councillor Taylor, Councillor Pascoe, Councillor Forsyth. Those to the contrary, there are none. That is passed unanimously. Thank you. Now, to our committee advisor, is there anything else we need to do?
Oh, that's it. Councillor.
No. So I just thank you. I thank Robin, obviously, and Eva Lisa very much, and particularly Robin, for your attendance and explanations. We would be grateful. Could you pass on to the team who's done a lot of this work, our compliments, and also compliments on how easy it is, particularly with the photographics, to understand that. So if there's no further business, I will now declare this.
Sorry. Councillor Forsyth.
Yes, Councillor Forsyth, sorry.
No worries, thanks, Chair. I'm just wanting to know, and I understand that we're in a lockdown phase, etc. How does everyone else feel about the number of changes and items that came to the table all at once this morning. And the reason I asked that is because I thought, wow, that's actually a lot to get through. And I know there's process and principles and all the rest of it, but actually to go through each of them one at a time and do each justice, I felt quite, it was a lot to chew in one session. So is it possible that we can have fewer items before this committee sits again to hear a similar parking changes? Parking, no stopping, traffic changes? Or is it I'm the only one that feels that way?
No, I'll just go to Robin in terms of some of the practical. I mean, it's an unusual situation because obviously we'd be in the chamber or committee room. I respect that. Members of the public who had a particular issue would either make a submission or come in. And having said that, they're now having to do this, like the rest of us in a virtual reality situation. I think, and I acknowledge as chair the point, I don't think we're different from the previous committee under Councillor Leary in terms of the bulk of stuff, but I guess it's the balance between the numerical bulk, Councillor Forsyth, versus the ability to make sure that we do justice to all these recommendations. And obviously we've pre-read the agenda, but I do acknowledge the bulk versus the ability of timing this committee to actually, and I have an open mind, timing this committee to process this. Robin, do you have any thoughts? And I guess what that does lead us to is what's kind of in terms of the numbers of recommendation, what future recommendations are ahead of us in the immediate future?
So I guess this is a typical report. What the members of the committee may find useful is if you look at attachment 2, we've actually set out in that attachment quite clearly, I believe, the parking restrictions that are actually new versus the tidy up. And page 75 and 76 actually illustrates the new, or list the new parking restrictions. So there were only in the order of about 12 to 15 actual new restrictions going through this time. The rest were tidy ups.
And I think probably but that's actually, Councillor Forsyth, some really useful feedback, because what that is telling me and Councillor Wilson as chairs, that in terms of our focus on the agenda and the debate and discussion is we'll be a bit, and perhaps Robin just remind us, when we present these recommendations, we'd obviously take the cluster of the new stuff first and focus our minds on that. It's a really good point, so that and in terms of anyone in the public gallery, we're crystal clear as to the narrative about the new stuff, the new recommendation, versus what you were saying is basically gazetting or formalising existing restrictions. Is that, have I got that right, Robin?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's a good procedural point that, Rebecca, if we could, in our discussions, remind ourselves of, just to make sure that we clearly delineate between the two. And I think that may address Councillor Forsyth's legitimate concerns. Any other further discussions before we close the meeting? Okay, without further ado, I now formally declare this meeting of Hearings and Engagement Committees formally closed. Thank you.
Thanks.